What's up everybody and welcome back to another Overwatch League discussion video. And today, my friends, as you can tell by the title of this video, we are talking about Logix, as the Florida Mayhem did recently release him. So he is a free agent, and I think this guy is a very underrated player, and he should be considered one of the most sought after free agents this year. I honestly feel like this guy just isn't talked about enough, as he's a seriously underrated player. He's good. I know he's not the best DPS player out there, but he is top tier. He's an Overwatch League player for a reason. I think that his Tracer and his Widowmaker are absolutely insane, and that can be reflected in the way that he played during Stage 2 of Overwatch League, as he was carrying Florida time after time, and he helped lead them to the most wins they'd ever get in a stage, which was sadly only 3, but still, the only reason they got those wins was because of the way he was playing. He was just going nuts. And I honestly feel bad for the guy because he was carrying so hard that he just got burnt out. He couldn't take it anymore. I mean, plus there weren't any replacements on the roster, no bench players at all, so that also helps. Luckily though, this wasn't the end of Logix for Overwatch League Season 1, as he did make a return in Stage 4, and again, he played quite well, and he helped them get the only win of their stage by making some clutch plays on that map 5 against Shanghai Dragons. The guy's an absolute beast, and I think there are many teams that would really benefit from having him. So, let's talk about 5 teams that should really go out and try and sign Logix during this offseason. Here we go. First up, at number 5, I have Dallas Fuel. And this is a team that really doesn't need Logix that much because they have Effect. But the only problem is, we don't know how long Effect's going to play for this season, as it's clear he's very mentally unstable, and let's say some more drama happens in his life or around the Dallas Fuel organization, he may want to get traded or step back from the team once again. And if that's the case, Fuel's going to need Logix. They need a decent Tracer player if Tracer does indeed become at least a somewhat big part of the meta again. Effect's nasty, obviously he's irreplaceable, one of the best in the world for that matter, but in the case that he does end up leaving the team, who do they have to play Tracer? They have AKM, Taimu, like that's not going to cut it. They really need another backup Tracer player just in case something happens to Effect. And that's all I really have to say about Logix potentially signing with Dallas Fuel, as there really isn't much more to talk about, as it's very clear that he would be a bench player unless, like I said before, something were to happen to Effect. But if Effect's able to keep a good mindset, there's no drama with him in the organization, then yeah, it's safe to say Logix will embrace the bench role on Dallas if he indeed signs there. So now let's move on to my next team on the list, shall we? Up next at my number 4 spot, I have the Boston Uprising. And yes, before I start talking about all the details, yes, I know that Striker and Logix play the same exact heroes, but just hear me out. For one, if they don't want to run Striker and Logix at the same time, you can always have Logix be a bench player in case something happens to Striker, whether it be like a wrist or hand injury, or maybe he gets burnt out and needs a game off. Then you can have Logix going and you really won't be losing out on that much. I know Striker is like a once-in-a-lifetime type of player. He's a god, but Logix is good too, like I've been stressing in this entire video. And one more point I quickly wanted to bring up before we move on to the next team is the fact that the meta may shift back into one we saw in Overwatch League Season 1. You never know with buffs and nerfs and all that. So let's say the meta shifts back into one where Tracer and Widowmaker are 2 DPSs you see a lot on certain maps. Then I think running Striker and Logix at the same time could be quite deadly, as they're both really good at Tracer and Widow, and Logix is a definite upgrade over mistakes at Widowmaker and Tracer if you ask me. So this is just a win-win situation overall for the Fuel and for Logix, because they'll still get a lot of playtime if the meta does indeed go back to the way it once was. With that being said, let's move on to my number 3 spot, which belongs to the LA Gladiators. And yes, kind of like with Striker, I know that Surefour is a really good hit scan player. His McCree and his Widowmaker are absolutely amazing, but I've never thought of him as the best Tracer player. And again, if Tracer becomes super relevant in the meta again, the Gladiators are going to want to have a good Tracer. It'll definitely help them out. And also, just like how I mentioned Striker and Logix would make for a good DPS duo if Widowmaker and Tracer are meta again, the same thing can be said for Surefour and Logix. Having Logix on Tracer and Surefour on Widow would make for a very deadly DPS duo, don't you think? And if you're in a certain situation, maybe you're on one map in particular, where you don't want to run a lot of Widowmaker, maybe she's not that good, you put Logix in because you want to play a lot of Tracer, and maybe, let's say, Carpe's on the other team and he's bodying you on Widow, he's just going off on her, then maybe you can just have Logix swap onto Widow and try and contest him. Because like I said before, Logix is not a bad Widow. Obviously, it's really hard to beat Carpe, but I think every once in a while he'd be able to win the Widow duel against him. I don't think that's crazy to say. And if the meta doesn't switch into a situation where you run a lot of Tracer, and you're still running a lot of Widow and other hit scans, maybe Hanzo or whatever it is, then you'd have Logix come off the bench, and if Surefour, kind of like with Striker, let's say he gets injured or he gets burnt out, you can just have Logix come in for a game or two or however many needs to be, and you won't really see much of a drop-off in production at all. And with that being said, let's move on to my second place team. Well, actually, I guess I should say teams for this number 2 spot because it belongs to all Western expansion teams. Any team that isn't building full Korean, full Chinese, or whatever else, those teams should try and pursue Logix because he's one of the best guys on the market right now, one of the best free agents, and sometimes it's a little difficult to find hidden gems in the rough, so why not get a well-established player? He can be the veteran on the team, whether Logix embraces a bench role or a starting role, or maybe he starts for half the season and goes to the bench, or vice versa. I think that this guy would be a very good pickup for any new team out there. And let's say one of these new expansion teams signs Shadowburn, who is an absolutely insane projectile player. Well, then you can have the two of them just pop off and be the leaders of the team, the main playmakers. Logix on Tracer and Widow, and McCree or Soldier, whatever other hit scan role, maybe even a little bit of projectile, but of course most of the projectile roles will belong to Shadowburn because he's a god tier Genji and Pharah. He can play Junkrat, Hanzo, whatever you need him to play. I believe that all expansion teams should seriously go out and give Logix a shot. Just give him a trial. Maybe if you don't like him, then you don't sign him, obviously. But just give him a shot. He's a good player and he played on a very bad team this year. I mean it when I say this dude could seriously shine if he was in the right environment with some decent players surrounding him. He could really help a team take a step to that next level and maybe even become a playoff team or at least a middle of the pack team at best, you know? And I guess that's enough about the expansion teams. Let's move on to my final spot. My number 1 spot on the list belongs to the Houston Outlaws. And my reasoning for having this as the team that needs Logix the most right now is pretty obvious, as Houston suffered from not having a super consistent and solid overall Tracer player. They tried using Clockwork as their Tracer specialist, and that did not work out at all, as they quickly transitioned Jake and Linkser to taking over the Tracer duties, and it still didn't work out that much. They made some plays sometimes, but Logix is better than both of them at Tracer. He would be a big-time help for this team. You could have a really scary DPS rotation with these 3 guys. Maybe, let's say you're on a map where you're not going to run a lot of Tracer, then you just put Jake and Linkser in. But maybe you're on Volskaya and you want to run Widow and Tracer, then maybe you take Jake out and then you put in Logix. Or maybe you're on a map where you don't want to run a lot of Widow, but you want to run like Tracer and maybe Pharah or Genji, then you take Linkser out and you keep Jake in. You could have a really good system and you could win a lot more games with someone like Logix on your team because, again, Houston Outlaws, they got dominated by a bunch of really good Tracers. It happened over and over again. This team would be way better in Overwatch League Season 1 if they just had a solid Tracer. And these guys were already pretty good. They got the 7th place finish in Overwatch League. I think they definitely could have had a few more wins under their belt if they had a hard carry Tracer like Logix on the squad. But I don't know if Houston wants Logix because I've heard rumors, I don't know if they're true, I'm assuming they are since they came from reliable sources, that the Outlaws are trying to trade for Dante from San Francisco Shock, and that's also not a bad option. He's a really good Tracer himself. He proved that during Stage 1 when Sinatra wasn't there, but also he's one of the best Sombras I've ever seen. Houston could definitely benefit from having this guy on their team, but the same could be said for Logix. So I really hope Outlaws go out and sign him because I just want to see Logix do well. I'm a huge fan of him if you can't already tell. I think that he really deserves to be on a good team. Being on Florida was just not fair. He was so good, but the rest of his team was very mediocre, especially his supports. But I'm not going to try and talk and trash about the Florida Mayhem too much because we're at the end of the video now, ladies and gentlemen. So, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you're new and enable notifications so you don't miss the next Overwatch League discussion video. Also, let me know what you think of my list. Do you think I put some teams too high, too low? Were there some teams that I missed out on and others that you think I should just take off of my list? Let me know all of your opinions in the comment section. Also, tell me what you think of Logix. because, like I've been saying, I think he's a really good player. He's super underrated, but maybe some of you share different opinions. I'm interested in getting some discussions going in the comment section below, so make sure to leave all of your thoughts. And until the next one, I'll catch all of you guys later.